The 21st century arrived with unexpected events, from the 9/11 terrorist attacks in 2001 to Putin's criminal invasion of Ukraine in the middle of a pandemic. We have lived or are paying the consequences of the Great Recession of 2008, the growing impact of climate change. We're struggling through the exponential era in technology. Liberal democracy is suffering from severe anemia. The global economy became insufficient to generate the opportunities that meet people's expectations. And with the possibility of a global recession, we are starting 2023 with extraordinary challenges, but also with great opportunities. Opportunities which have as conditions for their success the commitment and positive action of citizens and the strengthening of democratic institutions that guarantee civil liberties and the rule of law. To discuss these important matters that affect humans today, maybe more than ever, I have the privilege of presenting Dr. Francis Fukuyama, one of the most respected intellectuals on the planet. He is professor by courtesy of political science at Stanford University, from where he directs important academic programs related to international politics. Dr. Fukuyama is a successful global writer with more than 16 books. He has a PhD from Harvard in political science and has received major awards and honorary doctorates from universities on 3 continents. Dr. Fukuyama, welcome to Razón de Estado. I saw you on January 2nd on the beach in Carmel, California, in the rain, summarizing 2022 and talking about the outlook for 2023. You said that 2022 ended better than it started. Tell us briefly why, but especially tell us how do you see 2023?
Well, I think that at the beginning of 2022, the Russians were massing forces on the borders of Ukraine. Everybody expected some kind of military action. And then it turned out to be a full-scale invasion with the intent of overthrowing the regime in Kyiv and incorporating Ukraine into Russia. In this moment, a year later, it hasn't happened. The Russian invasion has been a big failure. Half the Russian army has been destroyed by the Ukrainians, who are defending their freedom very bravely. And the war has actually gone much better for Ukraine than anyone expected. So I would say that that's the first thing. But this is a year also that saw China, which looked again like a very strong authoritarian power that had done very well in COVID, suffer from massive protests because people could not tolerate the zero COVID policy that had been imposed. And now they've relaxed the policy and the number of COVID deaths is going through the roof. And so they look like a much less successful authoritarian state. The final thing I would say is that in the United States a year ago, I and many others were very worried that Donald Trump was placing officials in offices that would allow them to overturn a free election, a free and fair election in 2024. But on November 8th, most of those people were defeated, and it looks like that effort to undermine American democracy has also been beaten back. So I think between these 3 events, plus the big protests in Iran, we're doing better today than I would have thought a year ago.
Yeah. And for 23, how do we build from that?
Well, I think we need to support other democracies. I think that, one of the inspiring things about Ukraine has been the solidarity of NATO, as well as other democratic countries in providing Ukraine with the weapons and economic support that it needs to survive. However, one of the big issues, I think, is that smaller countries that are also facing big challenges to their democracy, like your country, Guatemala, sometimes fall off the radar scope of Washington or Brussels or other, developed parts of the world. And I think it's very important that we pay attention to the threats to democracy wherever they occur.
Yeah. Doctor, you often talk about the democratic recession that the world is experiencing, especially since 2008. However, most of Latin America has been coming out of one crisis for decades to enter another. We have not achieved rhythm and continuity to resolve the greatest misfortune we experience, our political underdevelopment. Nationalist and authoritarian populism, especially from the left, added to the corruption of politicians, organized crime, and the indifference of the elites makes us a failed region. What must happen in Latin America for us to rescue the course of liberal democracy and the rule of law?
Well, I think you're right that the politics has to stop alternating between populism of the left and populism of the right. And I think that the way to do that is by developing a different kind of politics that's more like that of Europe, where you have center left and center right policy parties. There was a moment in the 1990s when I think that might have happened in Mexico and Brazil and some of the bigger countries in your region. But unfortunately, there wasn't the leadership to create that kind of situation. And what was happening in that period was that inequality, which I think is one of the biggest drivers of populism, was actually decreasing because of sensible social policies. And now a lot of that has been undermined and dismantled, and I think that the region is going backwards, and it's going to continue to alternate between these two extremist populisms unless you can develop a center that is moderate and committed to, as you say, the rule of law and democratic values.
Yeah. Doctor, the Trump presidency and the attack on Congress in Washington accelerated the declining power and influence of the United States in Latin America. Today, the authoritarians, the corrupt, and the drug traffickers feel empowered. How can Washington reconnect with Latin America so that the United States once again becomes the exemplary beacon of rationality and political decency, legal certainty, and economic growth?
Well, there's several things that need to happen. First, we need to get our politics in order. I don't think the polarization in Washington has been much of a model or a beacon of liberty for anybody. And so we need to improve our game. We need to pay attention. As I was saying, I think that although the United States pays attention to Ukraine and other big geopolitical problems, Latin America is very easy to overlook. You don't have nuclear weapons, it's really only migrants that cause America to pay attention, and drugs in many respects. But Washington really needs to realize the importance of this region, the fact that the United States has to live with countries in Latin America and has an interest in their positive development. And I think that model, and then the kind of economic and trade support that the U.S. can give, would be important contributions.
Yeah. Dr. Left-wing authoritarians do not understand the economic process. Dictators prefer to govern poor people. The reality of Cuba and the Venezuelan debacle accounts for this. The same happens with the left populist as in the Argentinian disaster, or with the ideas and governance style of the Mexican president. What must happen for the people to choose better governments?
Well, there's not an easy formula for that. Part of the problem, I think, lies with the elites in many Latin American countries themselves that tend to cut themselves off from the real problems that face their societies. They travel to Miami and have nice homes and can, insulate themselves from the narco traffickers and the violence and poverty that's around them. I think you just need a different kind of leadership that is much more committed to building actual nations that aren't ruled by, a tiny elite at the top, but genuinely look to the interest of the broad population.
Yeah. We are living through a cycle of democratic recession from Turkey to Venezuela, from Myanmar to Tunisia. You have mentioned this, but also in India, the United States, and some European countries. It is evident that it is necessary to train and educate a new generation of technocrats, politicians, statesmen, leaders who understand the importance of democratic rule, respect for the law, and the relevance of continuity of public policies to achieve development and wellness. Why do academia and the world's economic elites, you were mentioning some things about them, pay so little attention to this? Is this how we could fix the discontents on liberalism?
Well, I think that there's been a lot of economic education. You know, you do have technocrats in Latin America. Central banks have gotten a lot better than they were, 30, 40 years ago. And so there's more competence in that realm. The problem, I think, lies in the legal and the political realm, where people really don't understand the way democracy is supposed to work. You know, why it's important to have an independent judiciary that's not simply the tool of whatever politician or political party, happens to be in office, why that needs to be, an independent institution. They don't understand the role of legislators and the need for expertise in policy. All of these things, I think, are components of a functioning democratic system. It does depend on education. It depends again on those same elites that are public spirited rather than simply looking to protect their families and their own, individual wealth.
Yeah. Doctor, the response of the brave and admirable Ukrainians to the criminals in the Kremlin, the evident deterioration of Putin's power, the protests in Iran, and the growing social and political crisis in China due to its handling of COVID, you were saying something about it, are proof that the authoritarian regimes are weakening. Is this a moment that the liberal democracies of the West should seize? And what can the cost or risks be of not doing so?
Well, I think that it depends on the country. I think that in the case of Russia's invasion, there's a lot that Western democracies can do to support Ukraine. If they were not getting the kind of military support that they have been, they simply would not have been able to resist Russia. And I think it's important for the NATO allies to continue to do that. In China's case, it's more difficult because they're a bigger and more powerful country. And there, I think that it's a question of containing their ambitions, because many people worry very much that China will want to forcibly reincorporate Taiwan, which is itself a vibrant and very healthy democracy. And so deterring China from doing that, I think, is important. And in general, it's a matter of paying attention, calling out dictators when they abuse their people, and showing them that the world is actually watching the way that they behave.
Yeah. Doctor, very briefly, in the few seconds that we have left, how do you see the end of the invasion of Ukraine and Putin's future?
Well, I think that I've been always more optimistic about Ukraine's chances, because there's an enormous difference in the motivation of the soldiers fighting on the Russian side and those on the Ukrainian side. The Ukrainians want to defend their families and their land, and the Russians don't understand why they're fighting. They've released a lot of criminals from prison and put them on the front lines simply as a way of getting out of jail. And so I do think that Ukraine can actually push Russia out of the territories that they occupied after February 24th of last year, and that it's not really safe to begin any kind of peace negotiation until they've done that.
Yeah. Dr. Fukuyama, despite its defects, liberal democracy, free markets, and the rule of law continue to be the path to development and well-being of the people. It's always a pleasure to hear you. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you, everyone. This is Razón de Estado. Suscríbete y nos ayudas a defender y a promover los valores de la libertad,